In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the European allies had hoped to usher in a much-needed period of peace and repose for a weary European continent. They were committed to preserving the new status quo, and even committed themselves to an international security alliance against revolutionary terror. Restoring stability also entailed restoring legitimate government to the continent. In creating the French Empire, French forces had deposed monarchs and dynasties across Europe. With Napoleon defeated, these old monarchs now sought to be returned to their rightful thrones once again, and they expected the Allied governments to assist them in this endeavor. Conservatives like Metternich were happy to oblige. Among these deposed monarchs was Fernando VII, the former king of Spain. In 1808, Fernando had lost his throne when Napoleonic forces crossed the Pyrenees and set up a puppet regime under Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. With the Iberian Peninsula now liberated, Fernando had every intention of reclaiming his rightful position as king, and in 1814, he returned to Madrid at the behest of the Allies. A firm supporter of absolutism, Fernando was motivated by desires to ensure the survival of Spanish royalism in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. However, it was difficult to deny that the Spain Fernando returned to in 1814 was not the one he had left behind. Occupation and revolutionary warfare had significantly impacted the country. The French invasion had provoked sharp political divisions between royalists and liberals. During the war years, Spanish society had dissolved into a series of bloody civil conflicts in which French collaborators, or afrancesados, battled against Spanish patriots and conservatives. Guerrilla fighters and militiamen had devastated entire sections of the country, leaving a trail of devastation and carnage in their midst. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, these factions had yet to be suppressed, leaving questions as to whether they would put down their arms and submit to royal authority. In addition to this political violence and instability, liberal constitutionalists had taken advantage of the anarchy to pursue their own goals. In 1812, liberals had issued a constitution on their own authority, declaring Spain a constitutional monarchy. The newly proclaimed Spanish Parliament, or Cortes, was still in power as Fernando returned, and liberals let it be known that if Fernando intended to rule as King of Spain, he was going to do so as a constitutional monarch. This liberal opposition did not bode well for Fernando's absolutist agenda. Yet even absolutists who supported monarchy were divided. Catholic conservatives and powerful aristocratic families were opposed to both liberalism and royal absolutism. These ultra-conservatives, banding together under the label of the Serviles, had a medievalist vision of Spain. Contrary to absolutist ideology, they desired a weak king who would govern in conjunction with the church and the nobility. As they saw it, restoring the power and influence of the landed nobility and Catholic Church was essential, and this meant undoing not only the gains of the revolution, but the entire absolutist state as well. Other monarchists supported royal absolutism, however. For them, a strong monarchy was needed to impose its will on the nobility and carry out necessary reforms in government and the economy. If these political divisions were not enough, Fernando also had to contend with the military. During the Peninsular War, military leaders had gained prestige and new powers as they defended the kingdom from French invasion. After the war, certain commanders were very mindful of any attempt by the state to limit their new authority. Already in 1814, commanders were threatening to create a rival point of authority against an absolutist restoration. They supported the Cortes as a check against royal power, believing a constitutional monarchy would safeguard their new standing in society. It did not help that the patriotic militias and guerrilla bands that had fought the French refused to disarm. According to these local militias, an armed citizenry was the best guarantee against a royal coup d'etat. The years of civil war had empowered citizens and local community leaders, and they were not about to relinquish their new sense of freedom for a returning émigré king with questionable political principles. These were the problems that beset Fernando as he returned to power in 1814, and it didn't help that the Spanish monarchy found itself pressed financially. Years of war, foreign occupation, and internal conflict had devastated the Spanish economy, leaving the new Restoration government in a precarious situation. In re-establishing royal government in Spain, Fernando would have to navigate between these various interests and factions. He aimed to enhance royal authority, continuing the absolutist reforms carried out by his predecessors prior to the 1790s. In this respect, he had little intention of catering to the serviles. Fernando recognized that he had been returned to power by the military, and in this respect, he calculated that he did not need to unconditionally support the aristocratic grandees. Nevertheless, he felt it wise to make symbolic gestures toward them in order to keep conservatives close to the crown. To this end, the Catholic Church was superficially restored to power as a moral authority in the kingdom. However, Fernando did not restore church property confiscated during the Napoleonic period, or even compensate the church for its financial losses. He even placed greater state controls on church officials, making them an arm of the state to ensure their obedience. In a similar fashion, Fernando brushed aside the demands of regional aristocrats. Centralized authority was to be the order of the day. The financial crisis necessitated enforcing taxation in the provinces and curbing traditional aristocratic powers. In line with his absolutist outlooks, strong state controls and powers were the only means of regenerating a debilitated Spanish kingdom. This plan also entailed weakening the Cortes, the institutional check on royal power imposed by liberals. Over the coming years, Fernando and his ministers gradually repealed certain provisions laid out in the 1812 Constitution. New laws regarding censorship and the expression of political opposition were decreed, drawing resentment from liberals. If they had hoped Fernando would rule as a constitutional monarch, this fantasy was now bitterly disappointed. Lastly, the military and militias had to be dealt with. Given the state of the economy, the government sought to curtail state expenditures, and this meant cutting back on the military. During the years of the Napoleonic invasion, the military bureaucracy had ballooned. With the war concluded, there was little need for such an extensive military. Returning POWs and officers who had been fighting in Europe only threatened to exacerbate this situation. There simply were not enough jobs for returning servicemen. To cut costs, the officer corps was reduced and many officers forced into early retirement. For soldiers who had fought against the French and helped restore the monarchy, this policy appeared a betrayal. With their pay cut, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars now faced looming financial hardship. At the same time, Fernando began disarming the patriot militias. In response, local patriots began warning of a royalist coup in the works. The monarchy was attempting to restore the old regime, and with it, erase the gains made during the war years, they complained. Faced with this affront, liberals and radicals resorted to underground activity. They formed secret societies and mobilized support against the retrenchment of Spanish absolutism. In short, Fernando's efforts to pursue his absolutist strategy were threatening to alienate the monarchy on various fronts, and it was not long before these various frustrations translated into real political grievances. In 1820, these brewing tensions boiled over. In the Cortes, liberals and radicals calling themselves exaltados began criticizing the new government policies. The more radical exaltados went as far as to threaten revolt if the king did not heed their warning. Outside the parliament, junior officers in the army also began protesting against the government. Many of these officers had supported Fernando during the war, believing he would honor his promise of abiding by a liberal-style constitution upon his return. However, as he began decommissioning army officers and rescinding many of the liberal provisions laid out in the constitution, the military lost patience. In response, ambitious military officials began staging pronunciamientos, in which they would gather in public spaces and voice their criticism of the government openly. These demonstrations were intended to show the military's frustration with the crown and encourage the king to honor his commitment to the liberal constitution. On the 1st of January, the Colonel Rafael del Riego, an official siding with the liberal exaltados in the Spanish parliament, staged a pronunciamiento calling for a nationwide opposition against the crown. His call registered with frustrated political opponents and officers alienated by the king's policies. Realizing that these public demonstrations could undermine his power, Fernando began negotiating with the military. Yet as he did so, Spanish radicals decided to capitalize on the king's weakened position. They summarily seized the initiative and put in a bid for power. In no uncertain terms, they were announcing a new revolution, and royalists responded with horror. In a fit of panic, the king and his supporters fled, abandoning the capital to the radicals. Radicals had clearly pushed the envelope, and faced with a sudden power vacuum, they did not hesitate to assume the functions of government and call upon the nation to rise up in revolt. Observers across Europe watched the Spanish situation with anticipation. For many liberal-minded thinkers, the situation in Spain was a welcome one. For those who had disagreed with the reactionary policies of Metternich and the Holy Alliance, this new Spanish Revolution was a testament to the resilience of liberalism and the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. Liberals across the continent insisted that Spain might be a spark to ignite another continental revolt, continuing the struggles for freedom and democracy begun in 1789. As the French liberal Dominique Duprat claimed, "Time and time again we have forgotten Spain, and now Spain calls to us." In Duprat's view, the Spanish crisis was not only a new revolution, It was a call to arms against reaction and conservatism, one that might echo throughout Europe and inspire liberals everywhere to mobilize against post-Napoleonic conservative forces. For Metternich and the Great Powers, the Spanish uprising was a grave threat to the security regime created in Vienna. The northern courts had no desire to see Europe once again thrust into revolution. The Spanish Revolution had to be stopped before this could occur. And so in the summer of 1820, it was decided to convoke the Holy Alliance and plot a course of action to deal with the evolving Spanish situation. Yet just as the diplomats were about to meet, the situation deteriorated. Encouraged by the political unrest in Spain, revolts began to break out in Naples, Portugal, and Piedmont Sardinia. As Duprat had prophesied, it suddenly appeared that the Spanish revolt might be the spark to set off another wave of revolutions, reigniting the violent political and military struggles that had destabilized the European continent. The Italian revolts stemmed from similar circumstances to those in Spain. The Congress of Vienna had restored King Ferdinand IV to the throne in southern Italy, returning the kingdom of Naples and Sicily back under absolutist rule. Much like his Spanish counterpart, Ferdinand intended to pursue an anti-revolutionary and absolutist program aimed at strengthening central authority. And just as in Spain, this alienated the monarchy from both the ultra-conservative aristocrats and liberals. As the police cracked down on opposition, more radical groups were driven underground. The most notable of these was a secret society known as the Carbonari. This revolutionary group had forged a base in the southern part of the peninsula, taking refuge in the Sicilian countryside. Among the chief founders of the Carbonari was the radical organizer and journalist Filippo Buonarroti. During the years of the French Revolution, Buonarroti had been a Jacobin supporter in France. He had worked closely with Gracchus Babeuf in planning the conspiracy of the equals, and from Babeuf, he had earned his revolutionary education, as Buonarroti phrased it. Upon returning to Italy, Buonarroti put this education to good use, helping form loose-knit secret societies like the Carbonari that would serve as an important vehicle in keeping the French revolutionary tradition alive during the Restoration period. Italian radicals upheld Jacobin and Rousseauvian ideas on politics. They committed themselves to the realization of Republican national government in the Italian peninsula, looking back to the revolutionary program of their Jacobin predecessors. Spurred on by the Spanish situation in 1820, Carbonaro conspirators plotted a revolt against Ferdinand and his absolutist government. Radicals in both Naples and Sicily joined together in an effort to overthrow the regime, aspiring to create a democratic nationalist government for southern Italy. The conspirators believed that in founding a southern republic, they would encourage the rest of the Italian peninsula to rise up in revolt, setting in motion a revolutionary movement that would achieve the creation of a unified Italian state. As unrest broke out in Iberia and Italy, conservatives had to wonder whether the struggles ignited by the French Revolution were about to seize the continent once again. Royalist and absolutist leaders warned of a supposed European-wide conspiracy, insisting provocateurs were working from inside Spain to bring down legitimate regimes and foment Jacobin terror. These accusations were groundless, but in the atmosphere of the 1820s, it was not difficult to see the rationale in this twisted logic. Yet while everyone worried about Spain, Metternich, the veritable leader of international conservatism, had his eyes fixed closer to home. The Italian situation posed an especially acute threat for the Austrian minister. Not only was revolution occurring in the heart of Europe, more to the point, it was occurring right on the border of the Austrian Empire. Austrian control extended across northern Italy. The provinces of Venetia and Lombardy were firmly within the Austrian Empire. Any whiff of Italian nationalism directly threatened the standing of the Habsburg monarchy. In a more general view, it was not too difficult to see the Italian revolts spreading and undoing everything that had been established at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. They had to be stopped. And so as these events gained momentum, Metternich called an emergency meeting of the Allies in the city of Trappeau. This conference was intended to organize a joint response in handling the Carbonari and the unrest roiling southern Italy. At the Congress, the three northern courts of Austria, Prussia, and Russia pledged support for the embattled government of Ferdinand IV. Metternich, who had a vested interest in resolving the Italian question, committed Austria to a military intervention, with the objective of crushing the nascent revolution and restoring order to the peninsula. In late 1820, Austrian forces engaged the small guerrilla band of revolutionaries and broke up the Carbonari networks. By the spring, the revolt had been suppressed. Metternich had no intention of compromising his principles. Order was needed, and order would be imposed. The breakup of the Carbonari did nothing to temper revolutionary zeal. In fact, as radical Republicans and liberals began fleeing Austrian forces in Italy, they sought out exile in Spain, intending to continue their fight from there. Italian liberals were in constant contact with their Spanish counterparts. As they saw it, Italians and Spaniards were now engaged in a common struggle. Both were fighting for the promise of liberal nation-states based upon the principles of the French Revolution. The Spanish revolutionary government even encouraged this camaraderie. In March of 1821, just before the revolutionary parliament in Naples was dissolved, Spanish diplomats authorized passports for Italians seeking political refuge from the Austrians. They were transported to Barcelona, and upon arrival immediately drafted into the Spanish army and given protection under Spanish law. Many Italians took advantage of this opportunity. But it was not simply opportunism that led them to Spain. Activists had begun to envision the potential of creating a liberal international, a movement united in revolutionary brotherhood and opposed to all forms of absolutism. As the Spanish leftist Pedro Muñoz Arroyo explained, "We are all rebels, revolutionaries, and insurgents in the eyes of the despotic leaders." It was essential, he insisted, to keep up the fight for a common European civilization against royal despotism. Many leftist liberals did just this. Italian generals formed brigades in Madrid and trained armies. Italian political writers ran newspapers in Barcelona, calling upon all those who love liberty to come and fight for the cause of liberation. Spanish agents traveled between France, England, and Italy, attempting to elicit international support and sympathy among liberals. The cause of liberty was a collective one, they argued. If reactionary leaders had formed a holy alliance to suppress liberalism across Europe, radicals were now calling for a holy alliance of the people against the forces of oppression. And while this radical rhetoric of international brotherhood buoyed the left, it was quickly apparent that Spanish moderates had no taste for it. In fact, they staunchly opposed it. In the Cortes, liberals were already beginning to grow weary of the radical left. Liberals had desired a constitutional regime. A chastened King Fernando appeared willing to concede this, but the radicals continued to push for further demands. Talk of forming a liberal international was even more suspect. Such an internationalist campaign validated conservative fears of conspiracy and undoubtedly would bring the intervention of the great powers, something that the liberals sought to avoid at all costs. With the example of Italy before them, Spanish moderates realized that radicalization would invite foreign occupation and suppression. A growing divide was evident among Spanish liberals. The generation of 1812 was content to have a liberal monarchy. The radicals of 1820 sought more, and these splits within the revolutionary cause played right into the hands of the monarchists. Over the next year, moderates passed laws in the Cortes that outlawed the patriotic clubs fomenting radicalism. They cracked down on the exaltados and sidelined their leaders in the parliament. If the liberals had been revolutionary in 1820, by 1822, they were proving to be reactionary, if not counter-revolutionary. And as this situation fragmented in Spain, the European powers realized the time was ripe to strike a blow against the radicals and snuff out the troublesome Spanish Revolution for good. In 1823, another Congress was called in Verona, where the four powers, plus France, were invited to form a joint policy on the Spanish crisis. As expected, the three northern courts voted in favor of military intervention. In April of 1823, some 60,000 French troops, accompanied by over 30,000 Spanish royalists, were ordered to march into Spain and restore order. The revolutionary militias were crushed, and Ferdinand was restored once again to the throne. Back in power, the king exacted revenge on his political enemies. He hunted down the mutinous commander Rafael del Riego and his patriot allies and had them executed, putting an end to the unrest. The 3 years of unrest and popular rule unleashed in 1820 was brought to a sudden and demoralizing end. Liberals across Europe had placed their faith in the Spanish cause, seeing in it the hope of a liberal European front against Metternich's conservative bulwark. By 1823, this had clearly failed, as the forces of order rooted out radical opponents and suppressed the uprising. While the collapse of the Spanish Revolution struck a blow to the dream of a liberal international, even as the Spanish situation was deteriorating, another opportunity began to present itself, this time in Greece. Greece had been incorporated into the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century as the Ottomans expanded across Europe. However, this did not imply that the Greeks had acquiesced to Ottoman Turkish rule. Greeks were distinct from the Turks. They spoke a different language, they possessed a distinct culture, and observed Orthodox Christianity as opposed to Islam, the official religion of the Ottoman Empire. The years of the French Revolution had inspired Greek nationalists, who began writing poems to the glory of the Greek people and evoking their ancient past, imagining it as a birthplace of Western civilization. Many wealthy Greeks had left the Balkans and established themselves in places such as Britain and the United States. These Greek expatriates played a key role in garnering international sympathy for the Greek people, who, they insisted, were suffering under a foreign and oppressive Ottoman rule. Aided by Greek exiles, nationalists at home set up secret societies of their own. These organizations coordinated action between Greek conspirators operating in the Balkans. Drawing inspiration from the movements in Spain and Italy, leaders decided the time had come for the Greek people to carry out their own revolution. By 1822, Greece was embroiled in its own revolt. Greek exiles in Europe and the US whipped up public support for the movement, depicting the Greek revolt as a nationalist liberation war against Ottoman barbarism. Poets and intellectuals expressed their sympathies for the Greek people, connecting them with the origins of Western civilization and Europe's heritage. This pronounced Philhellenism transformed Greece into another international crusade. In London, a Greek committee was set up to collect donations, organize activities, and even enlist volunteers in the war effort. Various public intellectuals took a stance. The poet Robert Browning lent his pen to the cause, calling people to join the revolt and take up arms on behalf of the Greek people. The most notable of these intellectuals was the renowned British poet Lord Byron, who, with the help of the London Committee, sailed to Greece in 1823 and ultimately died there, becoming a martyr of the Greek national liberation. In addition to public celebrities like Byron, the cause attracted a variety of liberals who had fought in Italy and Spain. Italian publicists in particular argued that Italy and Greece shared a common Mediterranean civilization dating back to the classical world. They wrote poems and songs celebrating this ancient brotherhood, and this perspective served to link the Italian and Greek movements currently at hand. It united their efforts in a common cause of nationalism and cosmopolitan patriotism that validated ideas of liberal internationalism and the common values it professed. As the Greek revolt wore on over the next decade, it was becoming evident that the 1820s was investing revolutionary activism with a new sense of purpose. Liberals and radicals lent their support to a vision of revolutionary fraternity that transcended national borders. Political activists moved across the Mediterranean, enlisting their services in a liberal crusade against the perceived injustices of absolute rule. They imagined a holy alliance of the people standing against the reactionary tendencies of politicians like Metternich. In this atmosphere of revolutionary cosmopolitanism, radicals fought and died on distant shores, preaching brotherhood and a collective sense of obligation to all those supportive of national emancipation and freedom. Conservatives watched with anxiety as this unrest erupted across the continent. Was this an epilogue to the French Revolution, or a new transformation in an ongoing struggle between revolution and the forces of public order? Whatever the case, one thing was evident. The values and memories of the revolution proved resilient. The French Revolution persisted to cast its long shadow across continental Europe.